Okay, here in Procreate, I'll open with some good news. You can import Photoshop brushes here. Now, doing so is a bit of a headache. The best way I found to do it is to access the Dropbox folder where the file is. I've provided a link for this. You'll need the Dropbox app, unfortunately. Anyway, here in Dropbox with the file active, click on the top right icon here, say Export, and then scroll over here and say Copy to Procreate. Now we're back in Procreate and it's importing. Once that's done, click on the Brush tool, and you'll find Marco Bucci Brush Pack right at the top. And this is great. All the icons are preserved, beautiful little previews of each brush, and I'm happy to say the quality of each brush is perfectly preserved. This brush looks exactly like it did in Photoshop. It automatically responds to pen pressure and stuff like that. Let's go back into the brush tool. Let's get my texture guy brush out. This one has some scattering on it, and yep, the scattering comes through in Procreate just like it does in Photoshop. Okay, now do you need my brushes? No, of course not. Procreate has so many good brushes. I'd probably venture to say, between the three apps we're looking at in this class, Procreate comes preloaded with the most expansive brush set. I'm not going to say best, because I don't think there is a best, but in terms of pure selection right out of the box, Procreate has it hands down. And as you can see, it's organized just so clearly. Procreate's interface is, bar none, the easiest to follow just intuitively. I like this burst brush a lot, by the way. It reminds me of when you're emptying a traditional airbrush by spraying out the excess paint, and you get all those fun little dots. Now, the brushes you'll find here in the brush tool are all that stamp style brush, like I described in Photoshop. It's a single stamp that gets repeated over and over, and that's how you get your brush stroke. If you want a more smudgy style brush, the smudge tool is just to the right of the brush tool, right here. Click on it again to access its brushes. And we get all the same brushes, it's just now Procreate is using this as a smudge tool. Okay, let's now talk about customizing your brushes. Let me go back into the brush tool here. Click on it again to bring up the menu. I've got my acrylic brush selected. If I want to modify that, I would click that acrylic brush again. This brings up the Brush Studio window. Just like in Krita, I have my scratch pad here on the right. And unlike Krita, this window is very straightforward and intuitive. I can raise the spacing and it turns into dots. Oh, and I love this update. As I change it, it updates the strokes. That is a feature I didn't even realize I was missing until I saw it here in Procreate. This is just great. Look at this. It makes customizing brushes so easy. I really like the fall off feature. So it starts strong and then falls off. You can obviously change how much fall off you want, but I really like the fall off feature. Let's go over a few more of these settings together. I'll select my Eagle Hawk brush, which is a great brush for obvious preview, I find. In the taper settings here, you can set it for pressure. Up here, it's like editing that curve in Krita, how hard you have to press the brush for different sizes. In the shape box, you can make things look a little bit more organic by increasing the scattering, which kind of affects the edge of the brush, kind of randomizes it almost. One setting I really like for that is the count mixed with count jitter. This will kind of make each edge slightly different, which of course is more similar to how we'd experience it in traditional media. Yeah, you can change the grain. Notice that live update is really helping us see the differences. When the scale is larger, the texture is effectively more blurry and digital. So I recommend using a smaller scale with most brushes. The depth will essentially control how much of that texture is even visible. Photoshop also had a depth slider, and it's nice to also be able to control the brightness and contrast of your texture, just to really fine-tune its look. Jumping down here to the color dynamics, we've seen this in Photoshop. You can just have the brush sort of play in and out of different hues and saturations. If you really ramp these up, you can see how it's kind of with each stamp, it's changing the hue, saturation, and lightness in this case. It is nice sometimes to have just a little bit of change. I don't like much hue change, but I do sometimes have a bit of saturation and just a touch of lightness change, again in the name of mimicking traditional media. And of course, if you don't care about that, then more power to you. You might still like the setting for the variety it gives you. And it gives you that variety for free. You don't even have to think about it. But don't overdo that, because it's really easy to have a brush that becomes unusable with too many of those settings. Stroke color jitter down here. I've honestly never used this. I'm not quite sure what it does, but anyway, it's there. You can play with it. Then your color pressure changes how much color is revealed or how much saturation or brightness is revealed based on your brush pressure. We saw a similar feature in Krita. I want to show you one more really cool brush setting. Let me just go pick my oil brush here to show you. So double tap on it, bring up the Brush Studio. Right now it just acts normally as you'd expect, but check this out. If I go to the Wet Mix tab and I turn the settings up somewhere roughly here, I've kind of memorized these settings. This slider is around there. This slider is a little greater around there. attack is very low, like maybe 3 or 4%, and the pull value is very high. Let's see, I think grade should go up a little bit too. What we get now is a brush that starts out as a brush, but turns into a smudgy brush, which is what the wet mix category implies, like it turns into a wet brush kind of. So watch this, if I push done, and I go back to my canvas here, I can make single strokes and it acts kind of as a regular brush. But if I click and keep that stroke going, it turns into a smudge tool. And the settings we just adjusted in the Brush Studio menu determine how quickly it turns into that smudge tool. So this is kind of a best of both worlds type of situation here. And it's something you might want to explore in your brush creations as well. And one other really cool brush feature I want to show you when it comes to smudge tool versus brush tool. If I go back into the gesture controls and go to the top smudge option, this top one here, a finger will always smudge. If I turn that on, hit done. Now watch this, I have just a regular hard brush selected there, and I'm picking up my Apple Pencil. Right now I'm using my Apple Pencil. It makes a regular brush stroke. But watch this, now I'm using my finger, and it smudges. This to me is a very intuitive way of negotiating the brush tool versus the smudge tool. Now the smudge tool doesn't use the round brush I have selected, it uses the smudge brush I have selected. In this case, the wet acrylic brush. So just keep that in mind. All right, with that, we are finished our exploration of brushes, although some related information is coming up in the next chapter, which is all about layers.